Welcome to Lesson 5. Here we'll take a nuanced look at the research on ketogenic diets and athletic performance. Here's an interesting way that Burke and Whitfield presented the data, and each of these dots represents a study that compared a ketogenic diet with a high carb, low fat, typical control diet. And they compared these effects on athletic performance, specifically endurance performance. And the pink space represents studies that showed a performance decrease as a result of the keto diet. And then the green space shows a performance increase and it only has one study over here showing a performance improvement with the keto diet. And then we've got a bunch of studies in the middle that showed no significant change either way. So the way that they presented the data here is interesting, and they make the valid point that meta-analyses, and which this is not a meta-analysis, this is what they call a dashboard of studies. So meta-analyses, to quote them, smash data into a heap. This is something that Louise Burke actually said on one of her tweets on X. They smash data, meta-analyses smash data into a heap, and she just was criticizing how meta-analyses draw singular conclusions from multiple study results. And she makes a great point. And that's the nature of the beast when it comes to meta-analyses. You're just looking at a bunch of heterogeneous designs, a bunch of different populations and protocols, and you are trying to essentially draw a single conclusion from a bunch of widely varied studies. And so presenting the data this way is really cool because it adds nuance. It shows that in some studies, the ketogenic diet caused a performance decrement. In other studies, well, in one exceptional study, it caused a performance improvement. And in several studies, there was no significant difference in performance between the ketogenic condition and the control condition. So another cool thing about the way they plotted this data, or these data rather, is the vertical axis shows the intensity of the exercise that was done. And so the dots that are higher up on this graph represent higher intensities that were engaged. And by the numbers here, 9 studies fall in the pink area where the ketogenic diet resulted in decreased endurance performance, compared to 1 study in the green area that showed increased performance. 9 studies showed no significant performance advantage of either condition. And something to take note of, the performance decreases from the ketogenic diet were of much greater magnitude overall than what happened with the 1 study where a performance increase was detected. So unsurprisingly, the authors concluded that the current literature does not support the proposal that low-carb, high-fat strategies are beneficial for performance in competitive endurance athletes. So this conclusion is a hard pill to swallow for people who are emotionally attached to the supposed superiority of ketogenic diets for endurance performance. It just doesn't bear out in the literature. But also we see a nuanced picture of the literature where, if anything, ketogenic diet isn't guaranteed to cause a performance decrease, but it sure looks like a bad bet, especially when the stakes are high. Okay, what we have here is the new ISSN position stand on ketogenic diets and athletic performance. It's actually the inaugural position stand on ketogenic diets and athletic performance. And I had the privilege of being one of the collaborating authors on this paper, which was just published. So we scoured the literature and boiled it down to a handful of position statements, which I'll go over. So the first position statement essentially defines what a ketogenic diet is. So I can kind of skip over that. Second position statement. So nutritional ketosis achieved through carbohydrate restriction and high dietary fat intake is not intrinsically harmful and should not be confused with ketoacidosis, which is a life-threatening condition most commonly seen in clinical populations and metabolic dysregulation. So the big point to reiterate there is that ketosis is not an inherent threat to health, not like ketoacidosis, where you have extraordinarily high levels of blood ketones. But what the, I guess, the pundits would call nutritional ketosis from consuming a diet that's carb restricted to 50 grams at most per day, it is not an inherent threat to health. Now, one could argue that in the long term, if you don't keep an eye on food selection, specifically the source of dietary fat, and if that's going to be what the majority of your calories are coming from, then you can build a case that, well, keto dieting can be a double-edged sword depending on food selection. But then again, that's the case with every diet. Okay, so our third position statement here, a ketogenic diet has largely neutral or detrimental effects on athletic performance compared to a diet higher in carbohydrates and lower in fat. And indeed, the evidence bears this out. Next position statement is the endurance effects of a ketogenic diet may be influenced by both training status and duration of the dietary intervention. Further research is necessary to elucidate these possibilities. So, interestingly, all studies involving elite athletes showed a performance decrement from a ketogenic diet. And this was in studies that lasted 6 weeks or less. Now, of the studies lasting more than 6 weeks, only one reported a statistically significant benefit of a ketogenic diet. So, once again, keto showing performance improvements is kind of like you're looking at a black swan. In other words, an exception. All right, the next position statement. A ketogenic diet tends to have similar effects on maximal strength or strength gains from a resistance training program compared to a diet higher in carbohydrates. So this is an interesting point. So unlike the endurance literature, which shows a more consistent disadvantage to the ketogenic diet, the literature examining maximal strength or strength gains is a little bit more forgiving towards the keto diet. So the keto diet conditions tend to compare pretty well to the high carb, low fat conditions for eliciting maximal strength gains. However, there's still a minority of studies in this group of studies that show superior effects of the high carb, low fat control diets compared to the ketogenic diets. So once again, we're still looking at a neutral to detrimental effect of ketogenic diets, just not to the same degree that it occurs when we're looking at endurance effects. So with strength effects, it's a little bit less of a gamble to go keto if you're trying to maximize, let's say, maximal strength gains in powerlifting. Or if you're trying to maximize lifting capacity and more towards the strength power side of the strength endurance continuum. But still, it's still a gamble, even if it's a slight gamble or a significantly less risky kind of gamble compared to doing keto with endurance competition. It's still a gamble. Position statement number 6, when compared to a diet higher in carbohydrates and lower in fat, a ketogenic diet may cause greater losses in body weight, fat mass, and surprisingly, fat-free mass, but may also heighten losses of lean tissue. However, this is likely due to differences in calorie and protein intake, as well as shifts in fluid balance. So this just reminds me of the point I need to make that in the literature looking at the effects of ketogenic diets versus some control diet, there often is the methodological flaw of failing to equate protein intake between the ketogenic diet and the control diet. And what that does is it gives the ketogenic diet the advantage of substantially higher protein, which comes along with it higher satiety and hunger control and spontaneous decrease in total caloric intake. Okay, position statement number 7. There's insufficient evidence to determine if a ketogenic diet affects males and females differently. Well, that's just the truth. And that concludes lesson 5. I'll see you back on lesson 6, where we finally wrap everything up with practical applications.